Good morning, everybody. Everyone can see in here, I hope. Good. In this day and age, we have to check. Are you out there? Am I here? Good. Okay. So today again, we are taking up the next gate in our 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination. And quick review, this is a text which shows up as the 11th fascicle of the 12 fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. It's mostly a long quote from another text called The Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So Dogen didn't come up with these 108, he didn't write this thing, but it got included in his writings. And at the end of this, he writes a paragraph, or writes a little bit, encouraging us to investigate these 108 gates. So that's what we've been doing, one gate per week. So this week, we are up to gate 71. Enjoyment as a part of the state of truth is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we attain many kinds of balanced state. So when you read that gate, it doesn't sound that interesting, but actually there's a ton to say. As usual, I can come up with lots of things to say about this gate. So again, we're wrapping up a section of this text, this 108 Gates text, that's describing the 37 constituent factors of Bodhi, or the 37 constituent factors of awakening. So we are on the last grouping. We've done lots of different groupings in this group of 37. We're on the last grouping, which is the 7 branches of the balanced truth, or that's one way to translate that. So again, our gate today is about enjoyment as one of those 7. So the Abhidharma, which is one of the texts of the Pali Canon, the earliest writings that we have, describes various kinds of heaven realms. There are 28 heaven realms, apparently, according to this text. But once you go there, you don't stay there forever. So this is not like a Christian heaven where you die and you go to heaven and you're there like forever. You might end up in one of these 28 heaven realms, but once you go there, you're not there forever and ever. You have a long life there full of lots of good things. You have access to various kinds of divine powers, so life is pretty good, but it is not nirvana. Eventually, you drop back down into some kind of a lower realm of existence. So, as a being in this heavenly realm, you go into a decline. It's really kind of interesting. The picture that gets painted of these beings kind of going into decline, they start becoming dirty and scruffy and smelly, and they don't enjoy being in the heaven realm anymore. So you just have to wonder what that's about. So your suffering and falling from this high place in this heaven realm is supposed to be 16 times greater than the suffering you would have as a being in a hell realm, which is really interesting, right? So you start out in this glorious, enjoyable position, but when you fall from that position, it is worse than being in a hell realm. So I think we can see this as a metaphor, right, for being attached to enjoyments that come from the pleasurable sensations that we get from objects, or objects of our 6 senses, right? So, as opposed to the enjoyment that comes from wisdom and compassion and being part of this sort of total functioning of the universe. So this is a different kind of enjoyment, right? And this is what our gate, I think, is pointing us to today. It's pointing us toward today. What exactly is enjoyment? Where is it coming from? What is the sustainable kind of enjoyment? What's wholesome and what's not wholesome? So Dogen says existing in the heavenly realm is really a hindrance because we don't really see any need to practice. If we're beings in heavenly realms, we think we've got it all. We think we're doing okay. We might not be terribly aware of suffering, whether that's our own or anybody else's. And we don't feel any bodhicitta. We don't feel any desire to practice because things seem to be just fine the way they are. And then when we inevitably lose all of these wonderful, pleasurable things that we're attached to in that heavenly realm, then we're really sunk. Because we kind of got nothing to fall back on, right? We got nowhere to go. We had everything, suddenly we have nothing. So we can see why this is a problem. This is a cause of suffering. So Uchiyama Roshi talked about what happens when modern people exist at the top of an organization and enjoy all kind of luxurious things, have very nice lives, luxurious lives, but they can't actually take care of themselves or anybody else. They're so used to having everything, they're not looking around at other people, and if somehow something happens to them, they don't have the skills. to take care of themselves. So if they're somehow cast out of that role, being the top of an organization, they don't have any power suddenly, and they're in for a lot of suffering because there's nothing else for them. So Hojo-san kind of brings all of these things together. And he says, Uchiyama Roshi says that modern people in developed countries who enjoy convenient lives without personal effort are like these heavenly beings. People at the top especially enjoy their lives. However, everything is impermanent. When they lose status, they experience much suffering, just like the heavenly beings of ancient Buddhist cosmology. Heaven is a man-made idea of what's better, in quotes. When we feel more successful than others, we're in heaven. When we feel others are more successful, we're in hell. To leave this way of life based on comparison is to free ourselves from samsara. Living on the ground of the true reality of life is finding nirvana within this world. So clearly the kind of enjoyment that goes with, a high socioeconomic status and trying to satisfy all of our sort of small self desires is not what this gate is talking about, right? I mean, that's a certain kind of enjoyment, not what today's gate is pointing us to. So in the early teachings, the Sanskrit term that's translated enjoyment in this gate means rejoicing or taking delight in the Dharma. It's a mental factor in a group of mental formations, and it arises when the meditator is concentrating on an object and moving through the first two stages of awakening. So anger is supposed to dissipate, concentration kind of strengthens, there's a sense of tranquility that goes with this rejoicing or taking delight in the Dharma in these first couple of stages. So this rapture, of course, can be either wholesome or unwholesome, and the texts make this point. If the rapture is arising because of attachment to objects of our senses that seem to be attractive somehow to our sense gates, that can be an unwholesome state. If it arises because of a steady, skillful practice, wisdom and compassion, and seeing the Dharma, then that's a wholesome state. So, early on, there's this distinction being made. Where is this enjoyment coming from? So it says that there are 5 kinds of rapture in these early texts. So that of a slight degree, the pleasure that causes the flesh to creep, is the way this is described. Second one is a momentary rapture, like a flash of lightning. Third one is rapture which resembles a flood, a kind of overwhelming joy resembling breakers on the seashore. Fourth is a floating or a transporting joy. It supposedly enables us to float in the air just like a wisp of cotton that's kind of borne on the wind. And the last one is this rapture which overflows. So this is a suffusing joy, like a flood that overflows small ponds or small tanks of water, something like that. So as for the many kind of balanced states that's in this gate, that's about complete meditative absorption, if we're looking at the early text, or complete awakening, right? Antar Samyak Sambodhi, this complete awakening. So if you achieve this state of rapture, then you're prepared to move on to the next stages in your meditation practice and eventually, somehow attain enlightenment. So if we fast forward from those early teachings about rapture as a stage of meditation to the 13th century, here comes Dogen, right? Here comes Soto Zen. Dogen means something else when he teaches about enjoyment or joy in the Dharma. So in Zen, of course, we don't have these meditative stages or, like a stepping stone that the early texts have, because there's nothing to achieve in Zazen, right? There's nothing to acquire. It's all right there. So there's no step ladder. Simply doing the 4 things that we do in Zazen, taking the posture, keeping the eyes open, breathing deeply, opening the hand of thought, right? The only 4 things we do in Zazen. Simply doing those 4 things is itself a complete manifestation of awakening. So there's nowhere else to go. There's nothing else to get. There's no kind of next stage for us. But that doesn't mean that there's no such thing as delight in the Dharma for us as Soto Zen practitioners doing Zazen. So Dogen commented on each of the gate statements in these related to these 37 factors of Bodhi. So as we've seen each week, there's a gate statement, and then Dogen has something to say about that. So, of course, he wrote a fascicle of his Shobogenzo about these 37 constituent factors. So his comment on today's gate puts it in context, I think, of the Mahayana and Zen and Soto Zen. So he says, joy as a limb of the truth is the sincerity of a granny's mind when blood is dripping. The thousand hands and eyes of great compassion. Leave them as they are, immensely busy. Plum flowers are peeping from the December snow. In the scenery of coming spring, a great master is cold. Even so, he is full of life and belly laughter. So when we hear this paragraph, all kinds of connections should be popping up for us, right? There's some familiar stuff in here. So we can take each of these sentences by itself, but of course they actually hang together as a whole. They're not unrelated to each other. So, joy as a limb of the truth, in other words, he's talking about this gate, is the sincerity of a granny's mind when blood is dripping. What a picture. Right? So, of course, we immediately go to the three minds, or Sanshin, right, that Dogen describes in the Tenzo Kyoken. So we have Roshin, or nurturing mind, we have Kishin, or joyful mind, and we have Daishin, or magnanimous mind. This is not new territory for us, right? Hojo-san talks about this all the time. Uchiyama Roshi writes about it in Opening the Hand of Thought, comes from the Tenzo Kyoken, Dogen's Tenzo Kyoken. So this goes a ways back in our tradition. And of course, it's what Sanshin Zen community is named for, right? These are the three minds with which we practice. Joyful and magnanimous spirit, along with a caring heart, are these three minds. So these are the three minds we need to have as we work and practice as part of a Sangha, or part of a community, or part of a family, or part of any group. They are the way we actualize our bodhisattva vow. So this is how things get concrete. We can make a vow, that sounds great. What does it look like on the ground? It looks like these three minds: kind mind, joyful mind, big mind. This is what it looks like. So it's how we treat each other. It's how we see our role or our purpose in a Sangha or in a community. Again, we can look at each one of these minds individually, but they arise together. They're really not disconnected. So there's specific things about each one, but we don't get one and then the next and then the next. They are all pointing to the same thing. They're all part of the same thing. So in English, Roshin is sometimes parental mind, nurturing mind, or grandmotherly mind. And aha, here's the granny's mind, right, in this quote from Dogen. So the sincerity of a granny's mind when blood is dripping. So when you were little and you cut your finger and you started to cry as a child, probably grandma stopped what she was doing, not only to provide you some comfort and dry your tears, but she probably washed that cut and put a Band-Aid on it and gave you a cookie, right? This is a very practical kind of care. It's a practical kind of compassion, this nurturing grandmotherly kind of mind. So elsewhere, Dogen teaches that this parental or grandmotherly mind is how we consider the three treasures. So it's not only the child in front of us, the family members, the Sangha members, it's all the way up to how do we consider our relationship with the three treasures. So we take care of them as though they were our only children. So Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, right? We have a responsibility for them. It's not just something we take. We also are caring for them. So we don't just say, oh yes, three treasures, how lovely. We actively care for Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. And we're happy to do that because feelings of compassion and gratitude arise naturally. And here is the basis for joyful spirit, right? So in the context of the Tenzo Kyoken, this is about how we prepare food for the Sangha. So again, this is a very practical, moment-by-moment, day-to-day manifestation of this teaching. So we plan that food thoughtfully. We watch over it carefully while it's cooking. I mean, he comes down to say, make sure like mice don't get into it. And, that sand doesn't end up in the rice and all kinds of things. He's very practical about the instructions there. So we're paying very close attention to what we're preparing for the Sangha because that food is what enables practice. And at the same time that we're doing that, we're also paying attention to everything else that's happening in the kitchen, everything else that's happening in the temple. So we're not so focused on this one thing that we ignore the rest of this one unified reality. And of course, this is the same mind we have in Zazen. So now we're connected back to Zazen, right? We do only the four things that we do in Zazen, and yet at the same time, we don't cling to those four things to the exclusion of the rest of our experience. So we're sitting there looking at a wall. We've taken the posture, the eyes are open, we're breathing, we're letting go of thought, but we're not unaware of what else is happening in the room. We're not focused only on our own sort of self-cultivation. We're letting go of the separation between self and others and self and universe. So all of this is part of our experience. So when you cut your finger, grandma helps you sincerely. She helps you wholeheartedly, but she keeps it all in perspective because the potatoes are still, boiling on the stove, right? Other things are still going on. So grandma's got all of this in her mind, and yet she can put down what she's doing, take care of you when the blood is dripping, and somehow manage all of this with this joyful spirit, with this kind heart and this joyful spirit. So that kind of Roshin is a manifestation of joy in the Dharma. She does that joyfully for you. So, next line, the 1,000 hands and eyes of great compassion, leave them as they are, immensely busy. So, of course, here Dogen is invoking Kanon, or Avalokiteshvara, in the form of Mahakaruna, which is literally great compassion. So, one form that he takes is a form that has 1,000 arms. And maybe you've seen this in some of the Buddhist iconography. You've seen a statue of Kanon, or Avalokiteshvara, with 1,000 arms. And of course, at the end of each arm is a hand, and in the palm of each hand is a wisdom eye. So that this is a being which is seeing all of the suffering of the world, and with 1,000 hands is also working to ameliorate all the suffering of the world. He gets to see everything and actually has the power to do something to help. And this is the name of that particular Kanon, Senju Kanon. Senju is 1,000 hands or 1,000 arms, right? So Senju Kanon. So Dogen wrote a fascicle about a famous koan in which one monk asks another what Senju Kanon does with all those hands and eyes. And maybe you've heard this koan. It's pretty well known. So the discussion in that fascicle touches on how we as karmic beings, limited karmic human beings, can function as Senju Kanon. So 1,000, when we say 1,000 arms or hands or eyes, of course, what that really means is an unlimited number. So 1,000 just means it's a huge number. It's not actually 1,000. It's an infinite number. So Senju Kanon is everywhere as part of the natural functioning of the universe. The natural functioning of this one unified reality is that there is helping. There is seeing of suffering, and there is helping. So liberating beings is part of the functioning of what Uchiyama Roshi calls the life force, right? Or the functioning of the universe. So if you've read Opening the Hand of Thought, he frequently refers to something he calls the life force, which is simply the functioning of this one unified reality. So seeing the true nature of all beings is unobstructed. Taking care of all beings is unobstructed. The joy that arises from all of that is unobstructed. So this is the total dynamic functioning, right? So there is suffering. There is seeing the suffering, there is helping with that suffering, there's liberating beings, and there's no obstruction to any of that. It works. It just keeps working. So this is what Senju Kanon is about. So leaving those very busy 1,000 hands and eyes as they are is to let them do what they do without hindrance, without obstruction. And for Dogen, this is the whole point of the joyful mind. This is what the joyful mind is all about. Not getting in the way of this liberating of beings and this functioning of the universe. So he says we need to be grateful not only for the chance to do our own practice, but also to be grateful for the chance to offer that practice in the world and to offer that practice to others by taking care of everything we encounter. So we need to sort of bear in mind that everything we encounter is our life. So we take care of each thing that we encounter with this grandmotherly, joyful, compassionate, caring mind. So joy means going about our activities with a light heart, not being resentful, not feeling martyred, not seeing our work as a burden. That's kind of a challenge sometimes, right? When we have a lot to do and there's a lot of demands, golly, it can be tough to carry that with a light heart. So our practice is, remember, every one of those tasks is an opportunity to manifest awakening. Every one of those tasks is a part of our practice. Every one of those tasks is Senju Kanon, right there, in the form of this one. Right? So there is some opportunity for joy in the midst of hard work, right? Hard effort. So we could play a bit of a game with ourselves if we want to in our life and in our practice and sort of challenge ourselves a bit and say, how much of the time can I remember to do each thing as a realization of Dharma in the world? So this is a mindfulness practice, right? We're right back to don't forget to practice and don't forget what Buddha taught and don't forget where real joy comes from. Because as soon as we're attached to something about this one, we've obstructed the joy, right? We've thrown a block, we've thrown a hindrance in this smooth functioning of Senju Kanon in the world. So next line, plum flowers are peeping from the December snow. So plum flowers, or baika, are one of Dogen's favorite images. These things show up in various places. He wrote a whole fascicle called baika about the plum blossoms. Sodashu named our form of hymn singing with handbells baika because of Dogen's affinity for these plum flowers. So if you look at the catalog, and yes, there is one for the accessories that go with baika practice, they've all got plum blossoms, right? All the fabrics for all our cases have plum blossoms. You know, I've got a plum blossom kotsu that I was given, right? So it's interesting how, you know, baika and singing and practice and all of this would go, you know, what's the connection? It's because Dogen really loved plum blossoms. They meant a lot for him. So plum blossoms bloom very early in the spring in Japan. It's one of the things that indicates that finally winter is breaking up. Finally spring is coming. Winter is ending. We had an old plum tree in front of Toshoji where I practiced in front of the Soto. It was the first thing to bloom every year. So it's like we knew. Finally, spring was coming because the plum blossoms were coming out on Kanon's plum tree. So even before the December snow has melted, according to this line, somehow the plum flowers are already there. So even though snow is still melting, already we're seeing and smelling these lovely plum blossoms. So the merit of these flowers is that they survive the severe cold of the winter and send out their fragrance even in the midst of snow. Even when winter is still not entirely gone, we see these flowers, which is a little sign of hope, maybe, right? They've survived a tough winter. They're blooming again. So in Dogen's teaching, plum flowers also represent the correctly transmitted Dharma. So frequently when he's talking about transmission of Dharma, whether that's person to person or in the context of the tradition, he's equating that with the blooming of a flower, in this case, plum flower. So there's a story about him that has to do with lineage and dreams about plum flowers. So Dogen, in this story, Dogen's on his pilgrimage to China, which we know, right? He went to China looking for some authentic teaching. He thought that he didn't have it there in Japan, so he was going backwards through the history, goes to China. So in his pilgrimage, he visits a certain temple, and when he gets there, the abbot of this temple shows him his own transmission documents. So these transmission documents are things that we receive from our own teacher when we are being authorized to function independently. As clergy, as teachers, we get the brown robe, we get 3 transmission documents. So it's unusual that anybody would, especially an abbot, would show to this person who's just arrived his transmission documents, because really you don't show those things to anybody, like not your close friends, not the people that you live with, your close disciples, unless there's like a really good reason. These are not things you go just casually kind of waving about in public. So here comes Dogen, you know, fresh off the boat, shows up at this temple, and the abbot says, you know, wants to show him these documents. So this is an unusual thing, and like this is some indication that something special is happening here, right? So Dogen got to see these documents because the abbot had just had a dream. Like less than a week before, he's had this dream where an eminent monk appears to him, holds out a branch of plum blossoms, and he says, if a strange person comes who has disembarked from a boat, do not withhold these flowers. So 5 days later, Dogen shows up. He comes on a boat from Japan. He arrives at this temple. So since these transmission documents were written on brocade, which had a kind of a plum blossom pattern in it, the abbot says, well, you must be the one from the dream. You know, you just got here, you got off the boat, plum blossoms, this is my transmission documents. You must be the guy that I'm looking for. So the abbot decides this dream is a prophecy, and he shows Dogen his documents. So that's all well and good. Dogen goes away. Dogen has a dream. He has a dream in which the same eminent ancestor monk comes to him with a branch of plum blossoms, and right after that, Dogen meets his teacher, Tendo Nyojo. So he says, okay, there was some coming together here, right? There's some indication that something special is happening. So Dogen equates the plum flower with the Udambara flower that Buddha held up when he simply held up the flower and Mahakashyapa smiled, which is a very famous story, right? The Udambara flower, you know, blooms like once every 3,000 years. It's a very special flower. He holds this thing up, doesn't say anything. Mahakashyapa gets the transmission. So that was, of course, supposed to be the first instance of Dharma transmission. Dogen equates plum blossoms with that Udambara flower. So once Dogen met his teacher, Tendo Nyojo, and he heard his Dharma teachings, then he realizes that the ordinary plum blossoms that he's seeing every day around him on the trees are a complete manifestation of thusness, just like the Udambara flower that Buddha held up for Mahakashyapa. He says it's the same thing, right? That transmission is there. That thusness it's not different. So he equates these two things. In other words, this self is Buddha. Awakening is already here. Thusness is already here. So plum blossoms, plum flowers are already peeping from the December snow in this limited karmic form. This self is Buddha, right? He's equating all of these teachings. So here's how we bring all of this back together. And then he says, in the scenery of coming spring, a great master is cold, even so he is full of life and belly laughter. So in the midst of hardship, right, enjoyment or delight in the Dharma is also there. In the midst of the snow, the flower is there. In this self, Buddha is here. In the midst of hardship, hard work, enjoyment, delight in the Dharma, rejoicing in the Dharma is already there. So the great master doesn't allow discomfort or picking and choosing or suffering to obscure the nature of reality for him. He already sees clearly. Awakening is here, Buddha is here. So it doesn't obstruct the arising of his laughter or the total functioning of the universe, total functioning of life or the universal self. So all of these things are again unobstructed. There may be cold, there may be snow, and yet still the laughter is there. The joy is there, right? The delight in the Dharma is there. So in one of his other teachings, Dogen asks, if this greatest cold does not penetrate into our bones, how will the fragrance of the plum blossoms pervade the entire universe? So this is not the only place he talks about this. If we cut off our experience of greatest cold, we also cut off the fragrance of the plum blossoms, right? So if there's no winter, there's no spring. If there's no effort, we could say there's no joy. If there's no giving, if there's no taking care of beings, then how does joy arise? How does delight in the Dharma arise? If we cut off delusion and samsara, we also cut off awakening and nirvana because these things arise together. So we can't cut off some part of our experience. We can pretend it doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? The reality is all of these things arise together. So Magnanimous Mind, which is one of those three minds, accepts all the conditions that there are and still finds joy somehow. It's still right in the middle of life unfolding, as Uchiyama Roshi might say. So we encounter or receive everything without craving and aversion and chasing and running away and all of that stuff, picking and choosing. We realize that it's all our own life, and we take care of all of it because that's where the joy is. So putting Dogen's comment now all back together, joy as a limb of the truth is the sincerity of a granny's mind when blood is dripping. The thousand hands and eyes of great compassion, leave them as they are, immensely busy. Plum flowers are peeping from the December snow. In the scenery of coming spring, a great master is cold. Even so, he is full of life and belly laughter. So joy in the Dharma arises when we see the three marks of existence, impermanence and interconnection and no self, and we take care of all beings on that basis, right? So we see clearly the nature of reality. We see clearly the nature of interconnection and all of those things. And on that basis, each thing we encounter, we take care of. Each being we encounter, we take care of. So we aren't hindered in carrying out our bodhisattva work by our karmic circumstances, right? Instead, we use our karmic circumstances to take care of beings. So it's not, oh, I'm in a limited human form, therefore there's nothing I can do for all these innumerable beings that I'm vowing to save. Instead, we say, what have I got to give, offer, use? What skills, abilities, experience do I have that I can bring to this circumstance so that I can do even a small thing to take care of beings? So, even in our limited human form with our likes and dislikes and delusion and all that stuff, we still have a responsibility and we still have the joy of encountering each thing and taking care of it in some appropriate way. Because along with all of that, we're wise enough to know that emptiness and awakening and joy don't depend on the absence of karmic conditions, delusion, picking and choosing, the mistakes that we make. If we're waiting for the perfect time to practice and the perfect conditions to practice, of course, we will never practice, right? So, in his comment, Dogen is including all three minds that we've talked about. So, joyful mind is completely interconnected with parental mind and with magnanimous mind. So, we can't kind of really pull these things apart. So, Uchiyama Roshi says, joyful mind is the mind that lives in accord with the true value of life. Joyful mind comes up as a dynamic feeling of truly being alive. Joyful mind does not mean a feeling of excitement at the fulfillment of some desire. Rather, joyful mind is discovering one's worth and passion for life through the action of parental mind towards everything we encounter. When we see each encounter as our life and function with the spirit that each and every encounter is our child to be looked after and taken care of, we will discover true ardor and passion and joy in being alive. Any bodhisattva aspiring to live in the way of Buddha will, without exception, possess these three minds of magnanimity, joy, and parental care. So we can see that there's been a real shift from the meaning of rapture in the early teachings down through our tradition, through Dogen to Soto Zen, right? There's a kind of a significant change in how we think about these teachings. So again, the gate statement says, enjoyment as a part of the state of truth is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it we attain many kind of balanced state. But now joy in the Dharma has moved from an individual physical project or a physical sensation that goes with a certain state in our meditation practice to something that isn't about individual small self at all. It's something that arises naturally when the universe is functioning without hindrances, without obstacles, when Senju Kanon is doing Senju Kanon's thing, right? So a real kind of shift in approach. So Uchiyama Roshi says that a joyful mind is discovering the true meaning of our lives through our parental attitude. And he says that what Dogen is really asking when he's teaching about joyful mind is, what direction are our lives taking? Where is our effort going? So we're back again to effort, which we talked about last time and in previous gates. Where are we going? What are we doing? Where are our resources going? This is kind of what Dogen wants us to ask ourselves when he's teaching about joyful mind. What are we doing with our lives? What should we be doing with our lives? Are we actually headed in the direction of our aspiration? We've taken vows, whether formally or not, just because we're doing the practice. So, how are we following up on that, right? Where is that actually going? So, if we're going to cultivate joyful mind, we have first to understand the significance of bodhisattva work. What is it really about? And then we have to pour everything we have into that in a kind of a seamless way. Doesn't leave any time or energy for having some idea about what great spiritual reward we're going to get from the practice of taking care of beings, right? There's just going to always be this little sticky thing in our hearts and minds that says, yes, Dogen says I should take care of all these beings. And if I do that, won't I be a great practitioner? Well, maybe, but somehow there's this little bit of gap that allows us to somehow have that conversation with ourselves. It says, yes, I'm going to take care of beings in order that I get something. I get awakening, or I get praise, or I get joy, or I get something, right? So we have to so completely pour ourselves into the bodhisattva work that gap closes up. There's no room for us to be saying, to be separated from what we're doing in such a way that we have an idea even about that. It is simply that grandchild cuts his finger, we are there, binding it up. There's no thinking about, if I do this, my grandchild will love me. We simply see blood's dripping and Senju Kanon is right there, right? So we just have to practice without that gap. So we're not taking care of beings in order to get to our own awakening or something. We're taking care of beings because awakening is already there, and we have the opportunity to realize it. So simply because awakening is here, we are taking care of beings. It's not the other way around. So we have the joy of completely realizing, making real that awakening in taking care of beings and in manifesting that joyful mind. So there's a short form meal verse that we use, which you may have heard. if we're not doing a full bore formal meal, which in other places includes a lot of chanting, in our particular style of Sanchin, we even do our meals, formal meals, silently as part of Sesshin. But if we go someplace else or we do a less formal meal, there is a short form meal verse that says, as we take food and drink, I vow with all beings to rejoice in Zazen, being filled with delight in the Dharma. That's the 4-line gata that goes with that. So interestingly, here we are again, joy in the Dharma, rejoicing in the Dharma, even doing something as simple as having an informal meal with our Sangha friends. So, I vow with all beings to rejoice in Zazen, being filled with delight in the Dharma. Well, maybe we're not always rejoicing when we sit down to Zazen. Maybe it's just awfully gosh darn early in the morning. Or, oh, geez, here I am on this cushion again, looking at this gosh darn wall. What am I doing? We don't always feel terribly joyful, maybe, when we sit down to Zazen. Sometimes it's kind of hard to rejoice in that practice. Our knees hurt, our back hurts, we don't want to be there. But in Zazen, of course, everything is unobstructed, so joyful mind naturally arises. So again, this is the kind of joy that goes with Dogen's joyful mind. This is not the joy that goes with, I'm doing Zazen to get something out of it. Or I don't want to be doing Zazen because I want to be, watching TV or doing something else. So rejoicing in Zazen is not about our personal feeling. Oh, I just love Zazen. That's not what's happening here. Maybe you love it. Good for you. Not what's happening here. This is not about our personal feeling. We're not vowing to convince ourselves to have a positive attitude towards Zazen, which sometimes we think we need to do. Geez, everyone around me seems to love this Zazen thing, and golly, I don't think it's that interesting. But maybe if I just convince myself, how wholesome this is, something will happen for me. Not what we're trying to do. We are vowing to get out of the way, really, so that delight in the Dharma can arise. We are vowing to sit right in the middle of the most profound kind of non-separation. That's what we're actually vowing to do, because naturally what comes out of that is a joyful spirit, because that's the joy that arises. So I vow to rejoice in Zazen, being filled with delight in the Dharma. Right? We are completely filled without gap in delight in the Dharma. So it's interesting how often I think food and joy are linked together in our lives and even in our practice, even in this little meal chant somehow. Oh, we got food and we got joy. Here it is again, right? So here's what Hojo-san has to say about this meal verse. When we eat, we should be happy. This happiness is the enjoyment of Dharma. We consider the taste of food to be the taste of Dharma. When we receive or eat a meal, we shouldn't grasp the taste. Usually when we eat, we encounter our food with our desires. These desires are the causes of delusion or samsara. The Buddha and Dogen Zenji teach us to become free from the desires caused by objects. This is Dogen's teaching of Shinjin Datsuraku, or dropping off body and mind. Our joy when we receive food is not the fulfillment of our desire. It is the joy of Dharma and Zazen. When we can see this reality, not only eating, but everything we do becomes our spiritual practice. So when we're receiving food, what are we actually receiving? Yes, there is the physical, carrots and potatoes and nourishment, and also we are receiving the Dharma. If everything we encounter is our life, the food we encounter is our life. Somebody's practice was to prepare that food for us. We are receiving that, right? That Dharma, that practice, that teaching. And so again, we see the wheel turning, right? We see the complete functioning of the universe. So Dogen says a joyful spirit is one of gratefulness and buoyancy. I think those are two wonderful words for this kind of joyful mind, enjoyment in this gate, gratefulness and buoyancy. So if we're feeling the opposite, sort of dragged down and heavy and put upon, we can ask ourselves, where am I stuck? What am I clinging to? What am I grabbing onto? What have I got myself attached to that somehow isn't happening here and is obstructing the joy, which is naturally here, the enjoyment which is naturally here. So, where is the gratefulness? Where is the buoyancy? So it's the most basic kind of suffering, right? Things should be different than what they are. Well, where does the should come from? Right? We got to look at the should. If I'm not feeling joyful here, what am I attached to? Now, this is not a teaching that is saying to us we need to suppress our fear, our anxiety, our anger, our discomfort. This is not saying we ignore those parts of ourselves and be Pollyanna somehow. Oh, everything's just fine. If we're doing that, we're also not looking clearly, right? So we need to see and acknowledge suffering, which is ours and everybody else's. This is not saying bypass what's, our emotional state. It is saying maybe we're attached to something which is obstructing joy which is there. It's keeping us from tapping into joy which is there, and only is allowing us to see, I feel burdened, I feel heavy, I don't feel buoyant, I don't feel grateful, I just feel unhappy. Okay, so when we, if we're stuck with something, it really gets in the way of the joy. So when we fall from the top of the pyramid, it's not a requirement that we abandon joy and we abandon enjoyment or joyful mind. And it would be easy to think, I'm at the top of my game and somehow I fall off that pyramid and I'm unhappy about that and there's no joy left for me. There's no requirement that says somehow on the way down, we get rid of the enjoyment. It is entirely possible to fall off the pyramid and still have joy. So enjoyment and awakening are not separate. As the gate statement says, if awakening is already there, then enjoyment is already there. So if we've fallen off the pyramid, awakening is still there. If awakening is there and Senju Kanon is there and the universe is still functioning unobstructed the way the universe functions, it should still be possible somewhere in that picture. Delight in the Dharma is still there. Rejoicing in the Dharma is still there. So we don't need to go looking for enjoyment, although, of course, that's the most basic kind of chasing that we do. As human beings in this limited form, we're always looking for something. I want, the prettier clothes. I want the better powerboat. I want the prettier life partner. I want more chocolate. Whatever it is for us that we're chasing after that's somehow going to give us more enjoyment. I want to get off this zazen cushion and go watch that movie. Whatever it is, we chase after the enjoyment. It's not actually necessary because it comes with whatever we're encountering if we're really seeing clearly, if we're seeing with the eyes of Buddha. If the wisdom, we're seeing with wisdom and compassion, that enjoyment is already there. So it doesn't mean we can't appreciate our favorite music or our friends or our hobbies, or, if we like football, doesn't mean we can't enjoy football. We don't have to give that stuff up in order to be good practitioners. We don't have to give up the chocolate ice cream, in order to be bodhisattvas. But can we also enjoy peppermint ice cream or peach ice cream just as much? If we've, fallen off the pyramid and somehow all we have is the peppermint, is there some joy there, right? Can we still enjoy that? Can we understand that all those flavors are the taste of Dharma? And can we take some joy in them? Even though in this human form, we pick and choose because it's what we do. So I'm going to give Uchiyama Roshi the last word today. He says, the true self, capital S self, the true self includes the entire world in which it lives. Therefore, there is nothing that is not a part of it. Everything encountered is life. To devote ourselves to everything we encounter and throw our life force into doing just that is quite different from simply exhausting our energies playing with toys. Here is where our passion for life as joyful mind manifests the significance of being alive. So what would you all like to say today about enjoyment, joyful mind, gratitude and buoyancy, or whatever is coming up for you? And don't forget to unmute yourself so that we can hear your pearls of wisdom. Who's got something to say today? Anyone feeling joyful? Satsu, and then I think I saw.
Go ahead, Carla.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hoko, thank you so much. Again, I just got the aha moment about the buoyancy, and sometimes when you're feeling down, that was very helpful. And then coming back to asking the question of what's up with you. So I'm always liking when you're pointing back. So thank you for that. The other thing that I had was a quick question about, it was very interesting because me and my friends get into a lot of discussions about the two ends of the spectrum about the wealthy and then the other end of the spectrum about the poor. It seems to be same, thing that arises, and for the wealthy or the established, it's, they're comfortable, they're not dealing with suffering. It reminded me of the Buddha story, again, even though, and then also the other spectrum of those that have a lack. It's similar things that evolve and arise for both of those, and even somewhere in the middle. Could you just comment a little bit more about that, please?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? We can have wonderful lives or comfortable life circumstances and still be dissatisfied, right? I mean, that's just one of the most basic teachings of our practice. Somehow it's never quite enough. We always want, something else, something else, something else. So I remember sometime back I gave a talk where I had actually looked at some kind of a study, and it was seriously like a 40 or 50-year-old study, but was still true today. It said once you have in your life a certain amount of economic stability, you can feed yourself, you can pay rent, you're in a safe place, you're at least, you have comfortable living. The more you own beyond that does not buy you any more happiness. People who had more were, in whatever measure they were using, were not reporting themselves to be any happier, right? In other words, no additional joy, right? So again, I think this teaching is not saying that people who are really suffering because they don't have food, they don't have clothes, they don't have a safe place to live, they're not in healthy circumstances because of their economic situation, this teaching is not saying that's okay. It's not saying, well, we ignore that. Well, those people should be happy because everyone's got joy in the Dharma. That's spiritual bypassing in like the worst possible way, right? It doesn't mean we don't have some responsibility to care for people, right? So we have to be careful about that, because it would be easy to take this teaching and say we can be complacent. If I'm okay where I am, then everyone else should recognize that they have all the joy they need too. Well, maybe not. If there are children going without food, probably as bodhisattvas, something needs to happen, whatever your chosen way to engage in the community is. So I think we have to be careful not to be too Pollyanna about this and say, well, we should all just kind of float through the world like, cotton, wisp of cotton on the wind and everything's fine. I think what it's pointing us to is in our individual circumstances, we can feel like if I own a lot of stuff and I have a lot of power, I am protected somehow from suffering. And we all know in this human form there is suffering. It's First Noble Truth. So we all know also everything's impermanent. So the day is going to come where we don't own all that stuff. And it might be the day, we get into the coffin and go into the ground, but at some point we don't own that stuff. So we're kind of not protected, right? I mean, there's going to be sickness and old age and death no matter how much we own. So we can either get caught up in that and say, I need more, I'm trying to stave that off. Or we can say, there's a certain amount of joy in the Dharma just because I'm moving through the world with clear eyes and wisdom and compassion, and I'm engaging with people in a wholesome way. We have to have some balance, just like everything else in our practice, see one reality from two sides, express two sides in one action. Here we are again, right? So on the one hand, there is Dharma joy everywhere. And on the other hand, we got to take care of our lives. And we have to take care of other people, and we have to look around as bodhisattvas and do what we can about suffering. So there's an interesting intersection there in our practice, right? How do we carry the joy, see the joy, appreciate the joy, understand what that really is, and also recognize there's suffering. So there's joy and suffering that are together. So like, how do those things coexist? It's a really interesting conundrum in our practice, right? So I think, Satsu, what you're raising is really interesting, right? Because it would be easy to just say, oh, well, there's joy everywhere. We don't need to do anything. And yet we vowed to do more than we can do in this lifetime, right? Buddha-san always says it takes more than our lifetime to carry out these vows. So we can carry out the vows with joy. That doesn't mean circumstances aren't tough, right? Do you want to follow up on that, Satsu, and zero in on anything particular there?
No, I mean, it's just, I find it, again, because we've been in the container of almost concentrated suffering right now, as we can see it, even though it's always been there. But I mean, for me, it just brought up, the what is that for me, what is it for me to do? And that may be nothing sometimes, and it's looks different for everyone else, but always going back to pointing at the buoyancy. If we're finding that whatever we're doing is dragging down, then what who I need to look back at is a part of that. So that's kind of what I was trying to bring full circle and to get your comments on that. But that's all I had. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, that's right, because when we're feeling exhausted, or as one of my friends who's a palliative care physician talks a lot about compassion fatigue. What is that? I wouldn't want to deny that compassion fatigue exists. And there are days where we have just done and done and done for others, and we feel just drained, right? We've given and given and given. There's no denying that we need to recharge. We're no good to anybody else if we're giving all the time. And then we fall prey to this martyrdom thing that says, am I not a wonderful bodhisattva because I'm working myself into the ground? Well, there's an attachment there. And the attachment there is, I have an idea about what it is to be a bodhisattva, and that's to self-deny, or to somehow injure myself in the service of others. That's an idea. That's not a reality. That's an idea. We can let go of that. And if that's where our attachment is, then that's something we get to look at. So there's lots of things to be attached to. It sounds like a very simple topic, right? Joy in the Dharma. And then you start getting into it, and there's lots to noodle with. So Carla, you wanted to jump in too, and I don't want to forget you.
No, my comment is a little odd. But it was just something that you said just jumped out at me when you said, you just have to get out of the way, and it was really, it jumped out at me today because that's sort of what I've been kind of thinking about. And, but I had to share just something because I just thought it was so awesome. So I feel like, and I've been alone all weekend. My husband's out of town. I have nobody to share this with. So, I've been I watched the first episode of this show called 100-Foot Wave. And I don't know if anybody has started watching this, but it's about this one man in particular, but this group of people who do they surf these big waves, like big waves. It's a special kind of surfing. And so this guy is in search of this 100-foot wave. But what came out was this, over the first episode, was this understanding that this man had of the water. Like he knew how to get out of the way and understood exactly what was happening all around him. And like you were talking about when you're sitting in Zazen and we're doing those things, we try to be aware of all of that. And so it just really jumped out at me, this sort of connection with that. And so I really appreciated that. And I wanted to share that and recommend this show to people because it's pretty amazing. So.
Well, it's an interesting metaphor, isn't it? Because, if you're riding a 100-foot wave, man, you're not going to change that wave. That wave can swamp you and you're done. There's just no fighting that wave. So you have to be able to predict something about how is it going to move? Where is it going to go? How fast is it going to go? What is my board in relation to that wave and how it moves? Because, I don't surf, but my guess is you tweak that board, it behaves differently, right? Yeah, so you really need to not be separate. I'm guessing that what you're seeing in this guy is that there's a real non-separation. He is not surfing. Surfing is happening, right? There's him on the wave, right? So I think, it's a great metaphor. And I think we encounter it in much less exotic ways. Maybe you're really good at cooking. You know how those ingredients behave. You know exactly how long to cook this thing before it becomes dry. You know exactly how to combine these things so they behave in a certain way. It could be something as simple as that. Hoshin is a woodworker. I'm sure he is so intimate with wood at this point that he can look at something and know this is going to work this way. This is going to look like this. I can use this wood for this purpose, but I have to use a different wood for that purpose, right? So even I think in just the daily activities that we engage in, and again, now we're talking about things that we could consider hobbies. For Hoshin, that's his business, right? But surfing, cooking, woodworking, these are things we could say are our hobbies. And yet, if we are really intimate with those materials, non-separate from those materials, what are we doing? We're getting out of the way and we're letting those materials do what they do. That wave is going to roll, that cake is going to rise, that piece of wood is going to turn into whatever it needs to turn into, and there's no separation. So I think that's where, again, we're getting out of the way life is unfolding, universe is unfolding, joy is arising, right? So when we think about what that means to kind of get out of the way, we can read that to mean I need to separate myself from something. Ironically, getting out of the way means we so fully 100% engage with whatever that is. Shinjin Datsudaku, drop off body and mind, no separation, right? So to get out of the way is not to pull yourself out of that equation, it's to 100% enter in. So we have to be careful about how we read that, I think. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that's actually a really important point in this teaching. Okay? Good. Sagan, please.
Yeah, the discussion about the wave reminded me a lot of Dogen's analogy of being out on the ocean on a boat and having to sort of negotiate the waves and the wind, in the sense that, you know, the person who's steering the boat is cooperating with the conditions and the waves and, you know, the movement of the universe. And also sort of reminds me of driving in the winter on snow and ice. In a sense, you know, if we cooperate, if we steer in the direction of the skid, we're sort of being non-dualistic. We're cooperating in a sense with the conditions. Whereas if we, you know, try to turn in the other direction, we go into a terrible skid.
Well, I'm a Minnesota girl, so let me tell you. I grew up driving in some winter, so that's an analogy that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that too is a wonderful image. As soon as we try to struggle with our lives, argue with our lives, I want things to be different than they are, we've got suffering, right? It doesn't mean that we shouldn't, it doesn't mean that it's inappropriate to work to change conditions. But how are we doing that? Are we doing that by butting heads with it? Or are we doing it by, as Sagan says, looking around, what's going on? How do I negotiate this thing that maybe I can't change to get to amelioration of suffering, right? Because as he says, we go against that, man, we're in a tailspin. Now we're no good to anybody. So there does seem to be this whole thing about cooperation. I think cooperation is a really good word. Let's cooperate with our lives. Doesn't mean we don't do work, doesn't mean we don't work for change. Can we do that by cooperating with our lives rather than struggling, right? Other things people want to say today? Mark, please.
Hi.
Hi.
It's strange being in here and everybody's out there. So we're talking about change. We're talking about change, trying to change things, or trying to make a change, putting that effort in. But we've also said that you're not, you're going up against the world. You're not, you can't really change things.
Some things.
Well, some things. So I mean, I have an idea of what it means to make that change, but I'm just curious for you to explain it a little bit more, because I mean, for me, it almost seems pointless. I mean, it really, yeah, because we appreciate to have the joy in the Dharma, right? Well, that kind of means to have joy in chaos. And when I say that, I know I'm skewing something. I know I'm focusing on one particular thing and not the whole equation. So I'm kind of curious to understand what it means to actually try to make that effort. When we practice, in intro, I tell people, you're not a zombie. You're not giving up yourself. You're not giving up your hopes, your dreams. You're just seeing where you are within life itself and those dreams are. If you don't get it, you just make the adjustments, right? So I'm just curious to see how we can make those changes.
So tell me about chaos.
Well, I mean, chaos is just the events of everything happening within life.
How is chaos different from life unfolding?
I don't see it as much. There are too many causes and conditions that happen such that you could really figure out the classic philosophy thought and the connectionism, to where you can make those connections into where you can re-engineer life such that it all works to your design. Chaos is just the multiplicity of conditions happening as we have them.
So it feels like chaos, it feels like there's a charge to a word like chaos, which says there are too many things that I can't control that aren't going the way I want.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the first thing we have to consider is, what is my attachment to control? What's my attachment to an outcome? If things don't go the way I want, now I have chaos. But if things do go the way I want, we have exactly probably the same number of causes and conditions and multiple threads and everything coming together. And yet, because I like it, it's not chaos. It's the beautiful, multifaceted unfolding of my life. Right? So it feels like there's no fear with that. Whereas, oh my gosh, things aren't going the way I want. Too many things are happening. I can't get my head around all of it. I can't control all of it. Therefore, it's uncomfortable. So I'm going to, decide that it's not okay. So maybe that's part of the problem. I think as limited human beings, that's not an unreasonable experience, right? There's so much happening. For someone like me, I have a temperament which is very much about the desire to predict and control my environment. So, I really like to know that if I do something, something's going to happen. That's just my temperament, and I know that about myself. And so to open my hand and say, I'm going to do the best I can do in this moment, not attaching to an outcome, using as much wisdom and compassion and, skill and whatever as I can, is a practice, because I want to plan and predict and control, right? So can we make change in the midst of all of that? Well, I don't know. We can aspire for a certain kind of change. Children are going to have enough food, or I'm going to lose 50 pounds, or whatever that is. We can aim in that direction. We can make our best effort. We can pour ourselves into it such that there's no gap. And we still can't control the outcome necessarily, because in this human limited form, we can't get our heads around all the possible things that could come in and disrupt our plan. All the possible things that could happen that are, we're not going to get the outcome necessarily that we expected. So, of course, we got to hold the outcome loosely. But it doesn't mean we don't work for change. It means we're dancing constantly. It means we're adjusting constantly. Because why? Everything is impermanent. So this universe is constantly moving, changing, unfolding. And we are, just like riding the wave, negotiating that. So that when some change happens, we have to dance with that a little bit. So it can feel overwhelming, and it can feel like I can't do this with much gratitude or buoyancy, because I feel like every time I take a step forward, I get knocked 2 steps back. Life is like that sometimes, right? But it may be that the more we can open our hands about expectation and our ideas about ourselves and the way things should be, we are better able to negotiate the chaos. We are better able to be in the midst of that unfolding and see what's happening and do the next thing and do the next thing and do the next thing. That sounds easy to say and not so easy to do, right? Mark is scowling over there trying to figure out how he's going to take all that in and do something with it, because these are teachings we hear. Yeah, there he goes. Because these are teachings we hear all the time, right? I mean, like, this isn't news for any of us, and yet when confronted with something, we just go, man, that just doesn't feel very satisfying. Where is the joy in this, right? We gotta keep opening the hand, right? So I think if we're feeling like we're in the midst of chaos, what is the chaos? What is chaos? What does that mean? And why, that feels like a label, which is not that it's not useful, but it's a label, right? So, like, what do we mean by that? Are we injecting some feeling into that circumstance? Or can we truly open the hand and say, there isn't an inch of ground to stand on? Everything we built is on sand. It's all moving all the time. We're clinging, grasping, the best we can, but the reality is there's nothing to hang on to. So what do I do now? there are, I would say, a lot of the koans, Hoshin's done some koan, where a lot of the koans seem to be based on that, right? It's like, there's nowhere to stand, there's nothing to cling to, what do I do now? Somebody just blew out the candle, I can't see, what do I do now? The pole I'm standing on, I've just stepped off of it, what do I do now? I think that's our whole life. I think that's like the metaphor for our whole life. And I think it's why we come to practice. We want some guidance. It's like the whole world is just spinning. And how do we make decisions? And how do we know what's good? And how do we know what's wholesome? And I think that's why we come to practice. So I think what you're raising is actually a really big question. I think it's actually a really important, like, deep practice question. So I don't know if anything I've said helps you.
Well, yeah, yes, it does. I mean, last night I actually did one of those weird things. I read, and I was Musalang's Trust in Mind. I pronounced his name right. And one of the interesting things I was reading was the difference between the Indian philosophical version of being versus the Western version. The Western side, being and becoming, are separate, whereas in the Indian version, being and becoming are the same. And there's some phrase he used, I can't remember it off the top of my head. So, I mean, that plays directly into what we're talking about in the sense that, it's chaos. It's chaos on the Western side, and I see some still Western side coming up in our discussion here too, to where being and becoming are separate, and so there is a separation.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when they're together, you're part of the entire world, and that's my idea. And I said I have some idea of it. So, for example, every time I'm a Doan, I will make a mistake. I have resigned myself to that. I practice very diligently to try not to make a mistake, but I do. And it's just, for me, it's a point to where I'll go, where am I going to make it? And I'll get towards the end. I haven't made one, and I made it. And there's the joy in doing that, because what I'm doing, there's a joy in doing that because there's being and becoming. And there's being becoming because it's all there all at once. Because I'm attempting to learn the Heart Sutra, Makahanya Haramita Shingyo, Dahi Shin Dharani. I can't even say it right at times. But as I try to learn that, I bring everything that I have to that, letting go all preconceptions, all those little, letting go of my mother, right? That I hold on to all these things, that I'm not perfect, I can never do better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We all have that parent, relative, friend that did that to us in growing up. Letting go of that and doing what I can. As I give that effort comes back to me, to where it changes me, to where, I'll get stuck on one section, I'll work through that, and then the beauty of the Dharma is that other things will pop up. Like eventually someday I will be able to. I will never be able to say Dharani. I don't. It will just come up naturally. Mm-hmm. So there's it's like sticking that incense, getting that incense perfect into the ash, right? As you stick that in there, it's not you and the incense separate. You're becoming together. Mm-hmm. So as you stick it in, the ash is telling you where to put it, how to apply the pressure. And as you learn to deal with that, there is that growth, that change, that becoming. That's the Dharma that we are. Mm-hmm. So it plays into what I've been thinking.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Being and becoming. And are they separate or not? We could do a whole other talk about that. Because that's really interesting, right? So when we're thinking about, making change, we're assuming there's something outside of this moment. And yet if being and becoming are the same thing, then then this moment has no boundary. So there is nothing outside of this moment. There's only the eternal now. So that means we do it the best we can in this eternal now, because of course this is the only time and place that we can practice. We can't practice, 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now or a year from now. So what are we doing right now? This is all there is. And if we know this is all there is, then it maybe becomes a little bit easier to open the hand and let go of, really clinging hard to the objective, which is supposed to happen at some future time, because, we can't do anything about that. So that's a whole other interesting, being and becoming would be a whole other interesting talk, which I wish we had time for. But yeah, I think it's not unrelated to what we're talking about. Absolutely. Yeah. Because, well, let me let me not go on, because I'll give you another Dharma talk and nobody wants that. Anything else this morning from anybody? Joy in the Dharma, rejoicing in Dharma. Brian, please.
This is more of a comment than a question, but early in your talk, you mentioned, you initially distinguished between different kinds of, what joy is and what joy isn't, versus kind of, just trying to establish what that is. And it reminded me something that I've noticed, or that I've thought about, is with a kind of economic prospering, just generally speaking, there has been, I think, a lot more options for finding kind of simple fulfillment, not the kind we're talking about, which I might just, for ease of talking about, call happiness versus joy. And I think what's really sad is that because there's such a marketplace for happiness, and people are all of us are so easily distracted by that many of the people I know, I think, or at least some, don't even know what joy is. And I think this is a really fundamental kind of cultural, spiritual loss that just isn't hardly even recognized. And one simple way that I think about it is, because people are so concentrated, and we're told that this is what you should be concentrating on, is whether you're happy or not. But this profound, at least in as I think of it, if I am joyful, I can be joyful while I am very sad, but I can't be happy if I'm sad. And so there's a much deeper, more significant thing, I think, that this Dharma Gate is talking about in the venue of our practice, that I just wish we, in one way we kind of bring that into the world is with what we do. But just the fact that most people, a lot of people don't even know what that is, I think is just sad. So
well, there's a lot of suffering out there, right? And people are treating their suffering with all kinds of things. They're treating it with gambling and drinking and buying things and unsafe behavior and all kinds of things. And I think you're right. You're raising something that says people, whether or not we all understand that we are suffering, we may not be ready to admit it, and we may not understand where that suffering comes from. I think for a lot of us, we get to this practice and we hear something like all of human life is characterized by suffering, and we go, yeah, that doesn't feel good. And then we start digging in and going, well, because the next thing that we say is, well, but I'm not suffering. Maybe you've had this experience. I certainly have. Somebody says, oh, I hear you do this Buddhist thing. Like, what's that about? And you talk about the Four Noble Truths. Life is characterized by suffering. And the first thing your friend says is, but I'm not suffering. And then you got a decision to make. Am I going to explain to this person why his life is completely riddled with suffering, or am I just going to let that go? But, I remember in the early days of my practice, I accepted that, life was characterized by suffering. But I noticed one day as I was walking down the street from my office to get the bus to go home, it was a hot summer day. I was walking down the sidewalk, and I realized, oh, the light's in my eyes. That really hurts. And then the bus went by with a picture of lovely French fries. Oh man, I'm hungry. I want those French fries. It was like one thing after another in the course of walking those few blocks to the bus stop. And I went, oh, I get it. We're not talking about always, huge suffering. We're talking about this little moment by moment dissatisfaction that everybody has. But if we pile up enough of that stuff and we don't know where it's coming from, then yeah, we think happiness is about, I get rid of all my little, I want this and I need that and I want more chocolate cake. And then we just kind of forget that there's anything other than satisfying those desires as a means to feel okay. If we realize that Dharma joy is always there, on some level, we can always feel okay. Even, as Brian says, we're in the midst of sadness. We're in the midst of grief. We're in the midst of some kind of discomfort. As I say, it doesn't mean we ignore that stuff. You know, somebody dies and we're sad about it. We don't suppress that and go, oh, that's not okay. No, we feel sad. Of course we do. And in the midst of that, there's Dharma joy that says, I really appreciate that I had the chance to know this person. Or this person really, impacted my life in a particular way. There's something else happening besides the small self saying, I'm not happy, right? So I think you're right, Brian. This gate is pointing us toward being able to tell the difference. As I said, there's nothing that says we can't enjoy, the chocolate ice cream and the folk music and the things that we enjoy. It's not saying we have to give all that up or that somehow it's not okay to enjoy those things. It's saying, do we see the difference? Right? Do we understand the difference between the things that bring us that sort of shorter term happiness and the things that, are really about the underlying joy, contentment, right? That's always there. I think it's kind of just helpful and reassuring to know there is that Dharma joy we can tap into regardless. It's like, well, things aren't as bad as they could be. That somehow that Dharma joy is always there. Anything else folks would like to say today? Enjoyment,
I have
Dharma joy. Hoshin, please.
put in there.
Good for you.
Just going on what you just were talking about. In my very early days of finally coming around and deciding I was a Buddhist, and I did Zen, being appropriate for some reason was really important to me. And then I came to see Zazen as a way to be available, to be appropriate.
Mm.
And so that's been, for some reason, I've been recycling this whole phrase. As I think about it, joy makes you available to be appropriate, at least in the Dharma sense. So it becomes a kind of instructional thing. You recognize the joy in your practice, the joy in the Dharma, the joy in what you do, the joy in service. Then there are the times when you're not quite available. You're suffering, you're sad, you're in a bad place. That, I think, can be kind of caught within the groove of the joy also, so that you're still there to be available. Mm-hmm. And I see that as the instruction of joy for this practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if we are tapped into that Dharma joy, then we can feel that there's no hindrance. We can feel that we've let go of hindrance. So even in the midst of however the small self is feeling, if that Dharma joy is there, I think then we are grateful, buoyant, available to people. So it's perhaps an interesting flag goes up when we say, geez, I just don't feel like helping anybody today. Okay, what's the hindrance? Because somehow something is obstructed. Which isn't, and I don't want to say we should take that and start judging ourselves. Oh, I'm not doing something right because I don't feel like helping people. But it's just a way to continue to ask the question, right? And to have that spirit of inquiry that says, something's not flowing. I don't feel available today. Like, okay, where am I stuck? That doesn't mean it's easy to get unstuck. It doesn't mean we ignore whatever is making us feel stuck. But I think it is another way to consider this whole dynamic, right? I think that whole piece about availability is really important. We don't feel available to people. Why? Because I'm stuck in my own little worldview about what's going on with me. Shinju Datsuraku, drop off body and mind, joy arises, I'm available for people. And I don't feel hindered. I don't feel frozen. That's a useful perspective. Other things anyone would like to say today? We're getting down past 11:30. Probably people want to go eat lunch. But I'm not having a conversation. Please, Cole.
I have. I regret not jumping in after Fusatsu because it gave birth to another question. But the short question is, when Mark was speaking, it made me think of, you spoke of joyful, magnanimous, and parental grandmotherly mind. At the same time, don't we have the three poisonous minds as well? And don't they kind of, I mean, that's what came to my mind when Mark was speaking, that that they work together, and that, yes, no?
Yeah, sure, of course they rise together, absolutely, because it's very difficult in this human form to ever be free from three poisonous mind: greed, anger, and ignorance.
Right.
So perhaps one of the ways that we counter three poisonous mind is, as Hoshin says, to be available to others and to not be hindered, because those three poisonous minds are hindrances, right? So how do we loosen the grip of those hindrances? You know, what can we let go of that loosens the grip of those hindrances so that we turn those three poisonous mind, greed, anger, and ignorance, into generosity and loving kindness and wisdom, which is the other side of those things, right? So I think when those three poisonous minds arise, we know some place we're blocked. And then we get to ask ourselves kindly, wisely and kindly, what's going on with ourselves. So yeah, certainly those three minds are there. Certainly the three poisons are there. And the three sunshine minds are also there. And that's the conundrum of this human form. We are karmically hindered. We are carrying karmic circumstance, and there is no getting around that. So how do we turn that? How do we use that energy? How do we pour ourselves into what we're doing? And perhaps use the fact that our three poisons are here to understand the three poisons in others. Maybe our experience of our own three poisons helps us to see clearly the suffering of other beings and how we might help. If I'm angry and I see somebody else is angry, I know what that experience of anger is like. How can I turn that and use it? If I see somebody else being selfish and greedy, well, I've been selfish and greedy in my life, so I know what that feels like. So how do I turn that, right? Saying, I think we can use all of our karmic circumstances in various skillful ways, recognizing that they arise at the same, that delusion arises at the same time that awakening is there. So samsara nirvana, how do we live in the intersection, is a central point of our practice. So coming from somebody who is named for joy, thank you for raising that interesting perspective.
And I have something else, starting with, I even forgot what she said in the beginning, but I had the wonderful pleasure last weekend of being able to sit a Zazenkai.
Oh.
And on my way home, I was still in that place. It's a 2.5 hour drive, so I was slowly moving home. But I had the opportunity to go and see someone in need. I don't want to go into the detail, but basically I was camping. So I had food, I had clothing, I had blankets, I had everything, and ended up giving to this person whatever he needed. What came to mind for me is I didn't see this as joyful in thinking about it. And I also wasn't unhappy for him. I mean, I was happy in being able to assist someone. But this brought to mind, is this what the Diamond Sutra refers to as sympathetic joy? Is that something?
So again, we could do another whole talk about that. I think usually what sympathetic joy is more about is something good is happening for somebody and we can rejoice for that person without feeling that we ourselves are diminished or have lost something. So it's not you win, I lose. It's you win, I also win, because we are already interconnected. And any good in this network is, good. Rising tide floats all boats, right? So I think that's a little bit different teaching. Equally important, but I think it's a slightly different teaching.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Other things this morning? Everyone joyful enough for today? All right. Okay, so I'm going to pitch back to Hoshin to do our closing chant, and we'll do some announcements. Please mute yourself if you've unmuted, just because chanting becomes a little bit of a problem as we do it all together virtually. Thanks for your practice and your discussion today, and we'll pitch over to Hoshin.